Connected Homeschooling, Episode 16.
This is PJ Jonas. I'm a homeschooling mom, blogger, and podcaster at goatmilkstuff.com. You're listening to Connected Homeschooling with Devin Dabney.
Welcome to the Connected Homeschooling Podcast, where we connect homeschooling families like yours with leaders, authors, speakers, and all-around interesting people who provide great conversations, tips, and advice. Now here's your host, Devin Dabney.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Connected Homeschooling. I'm glad that you're here, and I have a special treat for you this week. My interview is with Elizabeth Smith, the wife of co-founder and president of HSLDA, J. Michael Smith. She's here to share a lot of her wisdom that she's gained over the years in homeschooling and being a part of the homeschooling community, and I definitely had a great conversation with her as she shared wisdom for not only homeschooling moms, but also the dads in these families. So stay tuned for a great interview with Elizabeth. But first, this episode is brought to you by iHomeschool Studio. This is an online conference that lasts 4 days, February 11th through the 14th, and I happen to be one of the speakers. I'm going to be speaking on the topic, You Are Not Alone, Collaborative Homeschooling. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out at connectedhomeschooling.com/IHS 2014. Now for the interview with Elizabeth Smith. I'm pleased to introduce my guest this week, Mrs. Elizabeth Smith. She's a homeschooling mom, the wife of HSLDA President J. Michael Smith, one of the co-founders of HSLDA, and also a board member for the National Black Home Educators. Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's just great to be with you today.
Well, I'm so excited to actually have this time with you and also to bring you to my listeners on the Connected Homeschooling Podcast. I know that every time I've heard you speak, you've been such a valuable resource, and you've just had such experience and such wisdom, and I definitely wanted to share that with everyone who gets a chance to listen to this. So thank you so much for being here. One of the ways that we like to start off this show is to encourage people. And one of the best ways I've found to find encouragement is through the Word of God or through an inspirational quote. Would you share that with us?
Absolutely. And we actually had a homeschool verse that we picked in our family, and that was Matthew 6:33. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Now, that was an encouragement to me because I was feeling like an inadequate homeschool mom. But the verse and the promise of the scriptures is that he will add unto us all the things that we need. And I can't tell you how I claimed that verse over and over and over in my weak moments as a homeschooling mom.
Well, thank you so much. And we definitely have to do that as homeschooling families. And I like that idea as well, just having a homeschool verse for your family. That's something you can definitely live by and just get it down into your spirit. So what I want to do in this interview is to share a little bit of your homeschooling journey. I know a lot of people are familiar with you and your husband, but maybe many of them are not familiar with your story. So why don't you tell us how you got into homeschooling? How did you find out about it? How did homeschooling become a part of your life?
Well, a long time ago, this is around 1981 that we got involved with homeschooling. And like a number of families, we heard Dr. James Dobson give a special radio program on homeschooling. His guest on that particular day was Dr. Raymond Moore, who some may say consider the grandfather of homeschooling. He did wonderful research on how children learn cognitive skills and information that's valuable, learning styles, all of these things that come into play when we teach our children. And of course, part of his point was the schools teach one size fits all. So we recognize the privilege we have as homeschoolers is to choose curriculum and to really cater the things we choose to the way our children learn best. So when we heard that, actually, my husband is the one who heard it. He was driving the freeways of Los Angeles, going between court appearances that day, He was a trial attorney at that time, and he was listening to Focus on the Family. And this program came on that talked about parents teaching their own kids, and it arrested his attention immediately. Well, at the same time, our son was just turning 5 years old, and he was in preschool. And you know, the sweet little German lady at the preschool came to us and said, your son just is not ready for school. And sometimes my husband will say, how do you flunk preschool? But they suggested that we hold him back. And so then we put that together. We had that dilemma when this program came on about Dr. Moore. And he said things like, well, little boys develop more slowly in the early years than girls do. And so the difference between the most precocious girl in a first grade class and the least precocious boy can be as much as 5 years in maturity levels. Now, we need to have that sensitivity as parents so that we can not expect all of our children to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. God made each one differently and with different gifts and abilities according to his will. And so in homeschooling, we have that privilege. And my husband said, wow, maybe we can homeschool our son. And maybe that's the answer, because he was not academically ready. And so that was he was so excited that he came driving home after his appearance that morning and didn't even go to work, didn't even go to his office. He came home and he said, guess what? I've got the answer. And so he told me about it. And he will tell you that I said, and what would your role be? But what I was thinking, I was thinking, sounds good to me. You know, the scriptures say to count the cost, but it just didn't. It just sounded like a natural thing to do. And so that was the first step. And then my husband at that time then called Dr. Raymond Moore, and we became acquainted with him over the years. And he really introduced my husband into defending homeschoolers in California before HSLDA came along, which was only a year or two after that. So that's really that was the jumping off point. And we never looked back. Well, I might have looked back a few dozen times, but we really went for it. We loved what it did for our family.
Well, that's an interesting journey, and definitely something that I've never heard before, especially as part of your story. And just to see the excitement from your husband hearing that interview and hearing that program and not even going to work, but bringing it to your home and you embracing the idea, I'm sure it was a great way to encourage him in the decision that he had made.
Well, I think people would call that a God thing, wouldn't you?
Definitely.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, you made that decision and you mentioned that your son was 5. Mm-hmm. Now, how did you get started with that? Or were there any curricular choices that you made, or did Dr. Moore or different people make some suggestions? How did you get started with even knowing what to do as a homeschooling family?
Well, yes. And, you know, sometimes some homeschoolers have gotten away from this very effective approach that really does work. And in those early years, Dr. Moore had also written a book called Better Late Than Early. And his scientific research on child development, both he and his wife, Dorothy, were doctors, PhDs there. Their early research showed that children who delay formal education till age 7 or 8, and sometimes even older, advance more quickly. And one of the examples that he would give would be if you have a 5-year-old that loves to tinkle the keys on the piano, and they will do it every time they walk by a piano, we're likely to say, oh, the earlier I get them started at the piano, the better. They're 5 years old, set them down and start them. Dr. Moore will say, and the research bears out, that 5-year-old will learn at a very slow pace. And if we've done piano lessons with a 5-year-old, we know there's like 6 notes per bar or line or whatever it is. And so, but what Dr. Moore maintained and really demonstrates is if you wait till that child is 7 or 8, they will learn in 6 months what that 5-year-old took 3 years to learn. It's because of the maturing of the brain, the eyes, the hearing, cognitive skills, even eye-hand coordination, and fine motor skills when you're playing an instrument. So there's a lot of things. Your hearing maturity, your hearing is the first to mature, but then your eyesight and eyesight is a function of the brain, not a function of the eye. The eye does the communicating, but it's a brain function. So you need a certain amount of brain development and maturity. And so hearing gets better, eyesight gets better. Suddenly, when you're 9, you can thread a needle. And you couldn't thread that needle when you were 6 to save your soul, because these things are still growing and developing. And we as parents need to be cognizant of that, need to be aware of that, so that we don't put undue pressure on our children academically and burn them out before they even take off flying in the world of academia. So part of it, so then you say, well, what do I do when they're 5 years old and 6 years old and 7 years old? One, you read aloud. Reading aloud, I believe, is the best bonding agent there is between parent and child. You know, your children may not sit still for 3 minutes in church, but if you read them a story that's compelling, they'll sit still with you for a half hour. So even that little skill there, they're learning to give attention, to pay attention. They're stretching their attention span in a way that's very, very pleasurable. And then when we're reading books to our children, they have the ability to comprehend far beyond their ability to read and absorb themselves. So we're constantly imparting wonderful information, moral lessons, lessons for life, humor, things that become a part of their little characters. Now, ideal time to read those character books and things that introduce things we want our children to emulate and absorb into their own characters, integrity and honesty and truthfulness and productivity, not laziness, things like that. So we talk as we go along the way. And when our children are young like this, we are reading to them, but we're also including them in everything we do. I remember taking my children to the market. That was a big thing in the early days of homeschooling, so they could weigh the fruit and the vegetables, so they could count the number of apples we were buying, the number of bananas we were buying. They could understand a little bit about what we were doing. They're learning about life. One of my favorite sayings about homeschooling is school is never out. We are always teaching something. If it isn't a formal academic setting, we are teaching them to respect someone, to have good manners, to be considerate of other people. We're teaching them to be respectful in church. We have teaching moments all day long. And when these children are very young like this, 5 and 6 and 7, then we can use that time very wisely to instill in them skills for life, wonderful skills. And you can do science lesson. You can do a science experiment with children, and you don't need a textbook, and you can teach the principle of science. There are just museums are an endless supply of places to get kits, science kits. We did a doorbell. We made a circuit. We made a solar heater that only got lukewarm. And so they're seeing how their world works. And those are all teaching moments that are every bit as valuable as what goes on between the pages of the book. So I really encourage parents not to just think of education as what happens on page 13 and ends on page 240. That's too narrow a view. So my encouragement is to go outside the box, even pray. Remember, he says, all these things will be added unto you. God is the God of creativity and of ideas. And he will lead each parent and each family in ways that will assist them in educating their children for his glory.
I definitely agree with what you had to say, and it really reinforced something that I always say is that we have to cultivate an environment of learning. And I did an interview with a couple, and they were talking about just the different ways, or what do you do as far as homeschooling. I said, just as you go along with your daily tasks, you can homeschool. And just, you mentioned being in the market. That's one of our favorite things. You're in the store, and as the kids are learning colors, you ask them, hey, what color is that item over there? And then they can tell you, or you're counting things, you're doing things. And I believe there are actually studies that just show that if you assign meaning to a certain concept, then you definitely you'll retain the lessons instead of just regurgitating what's in the book. And so when you make those lessons applicable, then it just makes more sense. So I like what you said about that, and just especially focusing in the younger years. We can tend to focus so much on the academia and trying to emulate what's going on in the school, but when they're so young, it makes sense to focus on the life lessons and the character lessons, and teaching them to be citizens in the kingdom of God.
When we when we were spending this time with our children and bonding with them, we're building relationships, and you want to make sure that we value. One of my other sayings is relationships are the most important thing, because when the kids get older and they're in school and maybe they're 12 or 13 and they're starting to wonder whether, do I want to do this assignment? Do I want to sit down and do homeschool today or whatever? If you've built those relationships, you have bonded in relationships, loving relationships where your children desire to please you. And you really need to know, and your children need to know, we're all on the same team. We're pulling for their success academically, and we're there to assist and to motivate and mentor them. And so as we come alongside, building strong relationships, bonding, sharing and loving one another as a family, gives that child that desire to do what the parental instruction is calling them to do.
Okay, well, let's shift gears here. We've talked about some of the, I guess, the smooth ways of homeschooling and how you were able to transition to that. But did you run into some challenges with homeschooling?
Well, of course, as you go along the way, things come up. One thing I remember is that we used Mathit. It's called MATH-IT, and you can get it on the internet, but it's learning all your math facts. You learn everything by fourth grade, but it's by games. There's no book. and you play these games, and it's incredible. Dr. Raymond Moore had taught us about that. And then when our children start to do math, again, remembering they have different learning styles. And we liked Saxon math very much, and it's very popular in the homeschool movement. But I discovered almost too late that it wasn't the right method for one of my children. So I went to another publisher, which I happened to choose to be Bob Jones University Press math. And that was perfect for her. So as we go through, if a curriculum isn't clicking, it's not because necessarily they're disobedient or burned out, although that could be too. But it may be that we have chosen materials that don't work the same way their brain does. And so we trial and error and real struggles with mathematics, because she hated math was because in part that this methodology did not make sense to her. Now, she turned out to be a financial major in college, so we know we finally found the right textbooks. But that was one of the problems. Another problem is when they reach their teens, early teens, it's when they begin to think, do I like homeschooling? Do I want to be a homeschooler? And they may come to you and say, I want to go to school like the kids next door. And so we need to be ready for that. And we need to recognize that's not a bad thing. I'm glad they're telling us how they feel. We need to be in a position to tell our children why we're doing what we do. And we always want to convey to our children, just like we do in discipline, that what we're doing is an act of love. That our desire to give them an advantage in life, to prepare them as well as we possibly can, and that we know they will be better prepared than their counterparts in the public school. And we've got the facts, and we've got the surveys and so on to prove it. So we want to paint homeschooling in the best possible light to them, but understand they may say, I'd like to go. Honestly, in our neighborhood, every child on our block came to me and asked me to homeschool them.
Wow.
We were the only family. We lived there for 16 years, but each of those kids knew what was going on and that we were homeschooling, and they envied us. So in some say the classroom can be a harsh reality, harsh place. And it doesn't always confirm positive things in children. And we hear cases now of bullying and things like that. Those things should not be a part of a child's life. They should not be a part of a child's life. And in homeschooling, we have an opportunity to surround them with better things. And in the homeschool support groups. So some of the things that we encountered was them wishing maybe they could be in school, not feeling like doing their homework. We used to give incentives. I'd try to do incentives. I remember when I was particularly having trouble with algebra with one of them, my husband and I devised this plan that he would tell them that when he came home, he was going to check their schoolwork. Now, he had never done that, but that motivated them enough so that he never had to check their schoolwork. It was like, Dad's going to check my work. Oh, no. And so that was really effective. So sometimes husbands and wives working together on a solution, tag team style, where you back each other up. And then if the kids ever perceive between a mom and a dad that you're not on the same page, look out. They'll drive a wedge as big as Texas through that. And so mom and dad need to be unified and working together on their goals and supporting each other so the kids will know that all their protests are just hopeless.
Okay. Now, we're talking about homeschooling, which is something that when you say it to people who are outside of the homeschooling community, a lot of times the big thing that comes up is, well, what about socialization? Now, what would be your answer to people, or what has been your answer to people about the social aspects?
It's amazing. The socialization question has always been a big one. It's not nearly as big today because the National Home Education Research Institute has research that shows that homeschoolers are as well adjusted or better adjusted than their counterparts in the public schools. So if you were going to say, wow, you mean they're actually better adjusted? And the facts say that they are. Now, common sense was my approach. And when you're at home, you have the most intense, the most challenging relationships you will ever have in your entire life. And my motto is always, if you can get along at home, you can get along anywhere. That is where you learn your people skills. That is where you learn to get along. Where you learn how to do problem solving or resolve conflicts at home. Your 8-year-old playmate in school is not going to teach you how to resolve a conflict.
Definitely.
So the wisdom is that we've even got homeschoolers. It's not academic, but we've even got the edge on socialization.
Great. Now, your kids are grown and gone, as people would say. What are some of the things that you're doing to stay active within the homeschooling community, or even to support those of us who are still in the trenches?
Well, I do several things. Right after homeschooling, I spent 6.5 years as Director of Development at the Homeschool Foundation. That's the charitable arm of HSLDA, and that is hsf.org. But the Homeschool Foundation offers assistance to parents with struggling learners, single parents, widows. It's amazing the number of widows there are who continue to homeschool after the loss of their spouse. And our charitable arm reaches out to people who have been in natural disasters. We resupply curriculum. And for instance, in Hurricane Katrina and in Ike down there in the southern states, we replaced some windows. We did a few other things that we were able to do. But homeschoolers around the country are generous, and they give to these funds. And we disperse well over $1 million a year to help families that are struggling through homeschooling. So that was very dear to my heart, and the Homeschool Foundation still is. Their work is very satisfying and very rewarding, and it's so essential. I work with a prayer ministry, Breakthrough Intercessors, www.intercessors.org. This is an amazing ministry. It's been going on for, I'm going to say, over 30 years, 35 years. But we have nearly 4,000 intercessors around the world. If you place a prayer request at Breakthrough, they will send your request to 6 intercessors who will pray for you individually for 21 days.
Wow.
After the fashion of Daniel chapter 10, if you want to know more about it. So I have been an intercessor. I signed up to pray with that ministry almost 30 years ago. And so I get my about 6 times a year, I'll get a list of 5 people to pray for and so forth. But when I was in homeschooling, you know what? I couldn't go out and volunteer, and I love doing that. I couldn't go out and go to this activity or that activity. But you know what? I could have a ministry. I had the ministry of intercession, and I prayed for people. And I loved what that did in my life. I learned a lot about the Lord, and my faith grew. So that was one of the things I did. I'm still very active in the homeschool community. I speak at conferences around the country. In a couple of months here, I'm looking forward to a high school graduation of homeschoolers, which those are wonderful, uplifting experiences. If you can ever go to a graduation of homeschoolers, don't miss it. It will lift your spirits like nothing else. So we'll be going to some states out in the West. We're going up into Canada next month and so forth. So we want to encourage homeschoolers and families who are considering homeschooling. But I want to say one other thing. I've told people who do not choose homeschooling, you can be a homeschooler in your heart. You can do the things we do. You don't have all the time to do it, but your circumstances may prevent you from doing it. But you can be a homeschooler in your heart. Take responsibility for your child's education. Let them know that you're interested. Motivate them. Let them know how much it means to you that they're learning well, and participate with them. Just get on their team as they go through school. They may encounter some things that are very rough. Things don't seem to get better these days. But don't think just because you don't have your child at home that you can't have a homeschooling heart.
Now, that's very encouraging, especially for, like you mentioned, not everyone is in a place to homeschool, or just because of their circumstances or whatever the case may be. Just being a caring parent and being concerned about your child's education is definitely something that I encourage, and my wife as well. So thank you for the work that you do for so many of us. And we've talked a little bit about HSLDA, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into that and just talk about what HSLDA is. I know there are some people that are listening, like, what is HSLDA? So let's explain just what that is and what you guys do through HSLDA.
Okay, well, HSLDA stands for Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And back in 1983, Michael Ferris had the idea for an organization that would help families that were being persecuted and prosecuted for homeschooling. And he and my husband met. Mike Ferris shared the idea with my husband, and Mike co-founded HSLDA. And I would say at that moment, at that time when they were incorporated, I was on the original board, and so was Vicki Ferris. So pretty soon, Vicki Ferris and I decided it wasn't our calling in life. We had other things going on, and but the organization was started when homeschooling was illegal in almost every state. Homeschoolers were being harassed. Many times, homeschoolers would move to another state. Many times, they were threatened with having their children removed. Truant officers were after them. Special social services officers were after them. It was a scary time, and there were people who were arrested, and there were people whose children have been retained, and there were people who just had to pick up and run. I talked to a mother once that homeschooled during that time, and she said we had an escape route in our house. And I remember being in LA when California was hostile to homeschooling, and we kept our shades drawn. Our children did not go out between 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They never answered the door. They never answered the phone, because there was a chance you could get reported and have real trouble. And so HSLDA was founded to try to make it legal for every family, every person who wanted to homeschool to do so. And today that is largely true. What's interesting is that the challenges have continued to come, and that even though legislatures have passed favorable laws, they come back later. Sometimes it's through a teachers union or some group that doesn't sign on to the homeschool idea, and they try to change those laws to restrict the rights of families. So HSLDA really is an organization that promotes freedom and liberty for Americans, and to choose the type and manner of education that their children, that they want for their children. And there are people in our government and officials who don't want us to make choices for our children. They want to make the choices. But God has given us that responsibility. And so homeschooling is one of the ways we can do it. And we can make sure our kids are educated when they're at home. Education doesn't always take place in a classroom, but we can sure make sure it does.
Definitely, and I understand the importance of HSLDA. Over the time, just learning about the resources, and definitely the website at HSLDA, and then being able to see some of the free things that are available, but also some of the other offerings. Seeing more and more the importance of HSLDA and just supporting, and many of us can't fathom some of the things that you were talking about, and having to have an escape route and just keeping our kids in during certain times of the day. But thank God for people like you and your family for standing up during the time and just creating a way such that we would have the rights and the freedoms that we do now, and continuing to fight for those and with our rights as parents. I think that it definitely enables me, even in doing a program like this where I can bring on so many guests, because homeschooling has grown and I'm able to learn about so many resources and organizations that wouldn't have existed if homeschooling was illegal or it was something that we didn't have the right to do. So I appreciate that. And generally what I do at this point in the show is to go to a segment called 7 with Devin. But I'm going to do something different this time because I really want to get your wisdom, and especially for homeschooling moms. If you were to speak to a new homeschooling mom, or even one that's been doing it for some time, what would be your best advice for a homeschooling mom?
Well, this may not sound like it's homeschooling advice, but having homeschooled all those early years and having been in prayer ministry, actually, homeschooling is probably the reason I became such a prayer warrior, because I had so many things to pray about and so many needs. And back then it was the unknown. You didn't even know if it was going to work or not. No, nobody had really done it. And for the new homeschooler, pray and ask God to supply you with what you need. He will answer. He will meet you. Never feel discouraged that and think that you're at the end of yourself and what you can do. There's no such thing when you love God and belong to Him. And I'm just making a huge assumption. You love God and you do belong to Him. You are a Christian. You've accepted Christ. And so with that relationship comes power. And it's the power of God that is released in prayer. And so every July, I have to tell you this, I prayed every July and asked God what I should teach my children. I never assumed they will take science and math and Spanish, and I never assumed anything. I asked for His guidance, and I followed it every time. And every time He gave me answers, He led me to things. Early years, there was no curriculum fairs. Nobody would sell books to us. We had more problems than you can imagine. Let's think of homeschooling where there's no place to go and buy books. That's the way it was in the early years. So prayer is a large part of it. Relationships are the most important thing. So love your children and enjoy them. Don't get bogged down with curriculum. Curriculum is your tool. You're not a tool of the curriculum. The curriculum is not in charge. You're in charge. And you have to remember that and use it as a tool in your arsenal of things to train and teach your children. Don't let other people dictate what your homeschool should look like. Your family is unique. There are no two alike. It's like a fingerprint. So God is going to work with each family on the basis of what He knows in the future and what He knows now. And we can have absolute confidence in that. I would say from homeschooling moms in the beginning, but I kept it simple all the way through. Keep it simple. What do they really need to know? We didn't do grammar every year because those curriculums often just repeat themselves. So how about doing one grammar curriculum for 2 years, or taking a year off, or doing a game that teaches grammar? There's a Winston Grammar. That's the name of it. Winston Grammar. It's great. Teaches your kids all the things they need to know about grammar, and it's a game. Can you imagine something so pleasurable? Because grammar is not, I never found it to be fun. So Just think outside the box and be creative. And when you go to the curriculum halls, look for games that teach. And when you look at something, if you look at it and say, my child needs this, and if that is boring to you, trust me, it's going to be boring to them. Pick materials that you think will appeal to your children. Early learning, new readers. Children love books and stories that rhyme. They're hearing. There's something that enchants them about a poem. So you can do a lot in finding books and materials in poetry, fashion. Kids love things that make them laugh, funny stories. So that means that they're in homeschooling, hearing a story, they're laughing, they're having a good time equals I like homeschooling. So we've got those kinds of, so let's be wise as parents. And then teach your children to love home. So many of us will spend more time in the van than we spend in the house. That is not teaching our kids to love home, to be content. We actually went without TV for 10 years. And it was fine. But that because the motive was that our children would learn to love reading. And guess what? They love reading. They're still readers. They read all the time. But that because during those developmental years, they didn't have the television. They could sit there and be bored and twiddle their thumbs, or they could read a book. So I tried to be very creative about providing them with good books, going to used bookstores a lot, so that they had expanded their world and their imagination of what possibilities were in the future and what they might do in life.
More and more I'm seeing dads who are really embracing homeschooling and wanting to be a vocal part of it. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was able to participate in an online forum with 3 other homeschool dads. And we were just talking about some of the things that we face as homeschool dads, or some of the distractions that we have as far as digital things. But I'm seeing more dads being involved. And if you were able to just speak to dads, what's the best thing that we can do, or what should we be doing to make sure our homeschool is a success?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because we've gone through cycles in the homeschool movement where dads seem to be totally disappear. Then they kind of come on the scene again, and then they kind of disappear. But our children need their fathers as role models for what a man should be. Our children learn from their mothers how to be feminine, how to be a wife, how to be a mother. They learn from their father how to be a leader, how to be responsible for finances. And the father takes on his roles and his responsibility. And that daughter, it would not be unlikely that she would go out and find a husband that is modeled after the experience she's had at home. So you dads are really helping your daughters pick a husband. Not only that, you're teaching your sons how to be a husband and a head of a household, and to be masculine. And the idea that we've got to live out our roles, our feminine and our masculine roles for our children, is a part of their education. Very important. The other role that dad plays is he backs up mom. For in most homes, mom does the lion's share of the teaching. But there's got to be the teacher in the school and the principal. And dad is the principal, and he backs up mom all the way. And it's very important that dad show respect for mom. When I see a homeschool where the kids are being rebellious and not cooperating with the mother, the first question I ask is, what is your husband's perspective on this? And too often I find husbands not participating, not interested, not taking an active role. And it's to the disadvantage of our children.
Thank you for sharing that, and also for challenging us as dads. And I just sincerely appreciate your time for this interview today. And where people can find you online, I definitely know, is at HSLDA.org. And they can find all the information about that organization and the work that you all are doing. I'm going to link to the show notes for this episode and just the different things that you mentioned. And people can go online and they can find it at connectedhomeschooling.com/episode 16. And they'll be able to find all of the show notes, links, and everything that they need related with this interview. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I just would add at hslda.org, it will help families get started in homeschooling. There are some directions and help you find people in your local area as well. So that's another help that you can find.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of Connected Homeschooling. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Elizabeth Smith. I know she's such a blessing to the homeschooling community and such a valuable resource. If you'd like to connect with her, we'll link to her in the show notes for this episode at connectedhomeschooling.com/episode 16. And I also invite you to sign up and register for the iHomeschool Conference. It's going to be February 11th through the 14th. If you're unable to watch it live, you'll also receive MP3 files for all of the sessions over those 4 days. And you can sign up at connectedhomeschooling.com/IHS 2014. Thank you so much. I look forward to connecting with you guys on Google+, Facebook, and Twitter.